Okay, so last time on last portion of the video lecture we were already in the 20th century. We're jumping back in time now because remember when we were discussing Descartes, one of the implications of Descartes dualism was that it branched uh, the the study of the mind and behavior into two lines of study. One primarily physiological, which was the one that we followed up, and one that was primarily philosophical, which is the one that we are going to discuss now. And the most important um, uh, school of thought in the philosophy of mind, at least during the 17th and 18th century, and 19th century to some extent, was British empiricism, also known as British associationism. There were many philosophers, many very prestigious philosophers associated with this school. The handsome fellow that we have that I'm showing here is David Hume. But just as Hume, there was also John Locke, who was also another character associated with this school of thought. In general, the basic idea that all of them held was that the mind could well be represented as a blank slate. So here's a blank slate, and that experience, this is the other idea, experience writes the content of our mind. We come with no innate notions or knowledge at all. All of our knowledge comes from experience. And how does experience write on this blank slate that is our mind? Is through an important concept, which is the association of ideas. It should be more precisely described as association of experiences. So, for instance, for you or I, presumably, to learn the concept of a dog, there's a dog. The dog has many different features. It has some visual features. It's something that looks like, like a table in the sense that it has four legs. It has a wagging tail. It has a head. It has a trunk, so on and so forth. It has some auditory features. It barks. It smells in a particular way. It's called by a name. Usually we call it dog. Or we call it, something else, fluffy. And for many, you might have had experience of kids calling every dog Fluffy, or every dog the name of his or her dog, and that's because that's one of the characteristics of the dogs that we have experienced. They're called that way, and so on. It has a tactile experience also associated with a dog. It feels in a particular way, and all these different features of this particular object are associated with each other because they're correlated in time and space. They're correlated in time and space. They happen in the same place and they happen at the same time. And because of that, we learn to treat them as one single object. And we call that object a dog. And that's how our experience writes into our mind the notion of a dog. That's the main idea. Now, I have to take into consideration, of course, that there were some important criticisms to this approach. The most important one for us came from a school of thought called rationalism. And an important philosopher in this school of thought was Immanuel Kant. And what Kant suggested was a very important criticism to the British associationist approach, which was that if we are going to associate things depending on their correlation in time and space, then the mind has to be born with a notion of time and a notion of space. It cannot be it cannot come completely blank. You have to come pre-programmed with an idea of time and an idea of space. Um, and so um, and so that's a qualification possibly to uh, the British associationist hypothesis. In any case, all these ideas, were operating at the level of philosophy. Now, in the 19th century, there were enormous advances in science, of course, in physics, in chemistry, in biology, with Charles Darwin, in particular, with understanding of our understandings of microorganisms. And all of this suggested that many of the questions that had been in the purview of philosophy before could be approached from a scientific perspective, that is, through observation. And that's where our next character comes in. This is Wilhelm Wundt, and what Wundt suggested was that this hypothesis about associations being important for being essentially the content of our mind, if this were the case, then we should be able to study them scientifically in actual human subjects instead of just speculating about them at the philosophical level. Erase this. Oh, there you go. So Wilhelm Wundt, of course, because of this, he founded the first really legitimate psychological laboratory. He is thus the founder of experimental psychology. And even though he, in his laboratory, he used many interesting approaches to the empirical study of cognition and behavior. One method in particular came under fire, which was the method of introspection, which was a very important method for him to understand associations. So the idea was that if you had the idea of a dog, like we saw before, with its barking and its tail wagging and its particular tactile components and so on and so forth. The idea is that if you were a subject of in an experiment by Wundt, you would be trained to take each of these particular aspects of this association and to take it apart. The tactile, visual, auditory, olfactory components of this association, break them apart into more elemental sensations. And by looking at this, the idea was that we would have some access to the mental chemistry that allowed for associations to come to be. But to do this, you had to look inside in a very Augustinian kind of way. you have to think about the object and try to focus your attention on a particular aspect of it, um, uh, color or auditory sensation or something like that. And this kind of introspective approach, of course, was very problematic, particularly if you think of it um, from a comparative perspective, because if we know that animals also have minds, as we had already inferred from Darwin and the comparative psychologists, then how do we go about looking at the formation of associations in non-human animals? We can't ask them to introspect. That doesn't make much sense. But most importantly, how do we go about examining evidence, scientific evidence, that comes from an introspective experience? It's not public, it's not open for independent observations. One of the persons that was most vocal about the criticisms on introspection as a method was John B. Watson, who you may know from as a founder of behaviorism. That was the alternative approach that he proposed to the method of introspection. What Watson suggested was focusing on phenomena that was observable, focusing on public behavior. And if you think of it in a way, this comes full circle with Aristotle. He's talking about looking at what animals, including humans, actually do, and trying to understand that. And he thought that there was a very clear example of how modern psychology, modern behaviorist psychology, can be conducted. In he saw that example in another investigator, but this time this was a Russian man, Ivan Pavlov, who you may know from Pavlovian conditioning, and who was very well known in his time and today for proposing the notion of conditioned reflexes. So we're going to be talking a lot about Pavlovian conditioning right here. Conditioning, also known as classical conditioning. These are interchangeable terms. But the Pavlov didn't come to study conditioned reflexes and conditioning from a psychological perspective. He was studying digestion. This is what gave him, this kind of research was what gave him the Nobel Prize on Medicine and Physiology in 1904. It was his study of digestion, and he was interested in how the nervous system actually controlled digestion, and he came across some interesting phenomena suggesting that digestive responses, one of which was of course salivation, could come under the control not of the stimuli that naturally produces these responses, but can come under the control of relatively arbitrary stimuli. The prototypical example, of course, is the bell, which wasn't really a bell, but for purpose of this example, if that's okay. Bell that preceded the presentation of food, and over time, food, of course, naturally produces salivation. That is an unconditioned reflex because you don't need any kind of training for food to produce salivation. But over time, this pairing of bell and food came to uh, produce, resulted in the bell producing salivation itself. And this is a conditioned reflex because it depends, is conditional on a particular kind of experience. Right? Think of what are the implications for associationists, people that were interested in how mental associations were conducted. If you think of it, this may provide an empirical answer to the problem of a scientific answer, to the problem of how associations are formed. You may argue that on the basis of this conditioned reflex, that the animal has learned a particular association between bell and food, between something completely that is not naturally associated with food and food. And maybe this is how the associations that British associationists were interested in, maybe this is how they were formed. Our last character in this brief history and necessarily simplified history of psychology in general, but with an emphasis on what's relevant on learning and behavior, our last character is, of course, B.F. Skinner. After Watson proposed his criticisms on the method of introspection, his approach became very popular, particularly in the United States. Many researchers took up the idea of conducting empirical research, much like Pavlov was conducting research with unconditioned reflexes, to do it empirically and to base all inferences on observation. This seemed like the right approach, and B.F. Skinner was probably one of the most noticeable figures in the first half of the 20th century that took on this idea. And his main contribution, for our purpose at least, is the idea that conditioned reflexes come in two types, or like in two flavors. The one that Pavlov had already suggested, which he called conditioned reflexes type 1. So type 1 was Pavlovian conditioning, and as if you remember, that the critical aspect of Pavlovian conditioning is that the result of it is a stimulus eliciting a response, by virtue of this stimulus being paired to another stimulus. But the stimulus precedes, the conditioned stimulus precedes the conditioned reflex or a conditioned response. Skinner suggested there was a second type of reflex, which would eventually come to be called operant or instrumental conditioning, in which the response in a particular situation precedes the outcome, or the stimulus of interest, and it is maintained, this response is maintained because of its because it produces this particular outcome. It's not maintained because a particular stimulus precedes it, but because a particular stimulus follows it. He proposed thus what is now known as the three-term contingency, which is the antecedent stimulus, the response, and the outcome. And if you think of it, this is very similar This is very much tied very closely to the idea of the law of effect proposed by Thorndike. Under certain circumstances, in certain situations, a response that results in a particular kind of outcome, a satisfying outcome, let's call it, results in the strengthening of this response. This is the basis of operant conditioning. And Skinner saw this as a process that was more representative of learning in most animals. That this was the basis of most of our learning, that provided all the richness and the variability in our behavioral repertoire, and is going to be the basis of most of what we're going to be studying this semester.